Greeting and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has raised an urgent and under-examined question. Where exactly does Russia stand, and what is it doing about it? Moscow has provided Iran with satellite intelligence, drone technology, and military components, yet has stopped well short of any formal commitment or direct intervention. The Russia Iran partnership sits at the intersection of great power competition, arms transfer, and competing interests in the Middle East. And understanding it is essential to understanding how this conflict develops and how it ends. To walk us through the strategic calculus behind Moscow's position, I'm joined tonight from Washington by Professor Mark Katz, Professor Emeritus of Government and Politics at George Mason University, and one of the leading authorities on Russian foreign policy. Professor Katz, thank you so much for joining us, and particularly on the Easter day at such a short notice. We are very grateful, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always good to be on this program.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that Russia is giving Iran satellite data and intelligence, but has not stepped in militarily. Is this careful, deliberate restraint, or is Moscow keeping things vague on purpose so it can influence the conflict without being held accountable? In easy words, is Moscow going for some sort of a plausible deniability?
Well, I think that it's not surprising at all that they haven't done more. Because I would have been very surprised if they had sent troops or delivered, heavy weapons, very visibly. But I think, though, that delivering this sort of satellite intelligence, helping with the Iranians to launch attacks, whether it's on U.S. positions or just on their various neighbors. Obviously, I think that in one sense, I think it's, Putin sees this as doing to America what America's done to Russia. In other words, that the U.S. has given satellite intelligence to Ukraine to hit targets either in occupied Ukraine or in Russia itself. So I think he sees this as something similar. And it's the Iranians have obviously made good use of this. They've hit a lot of targets, and I think their hope is that by striking targets, whether it's in the Gulf, in Turkey, in Israel, that they will, governments there will want to stop this, will want to get the U.S. to stop and Israel to stop attacking Iran. Of course, obviously that hasn't quite worked out. But the Russians are seen, but the fact that they're doing this seems to indicate that they see the ongoing conflict as something worth supporting. They obviously don't want the Iranian government to collapse, but they have paid a price, and the price is that several Arab countries have now turned to Ukraine for military assistance against drone attacks with Iranian drones, which they have a lot of experience with. And we've seen Ukrainian President Zelensky visit several Middle Eastern countries. I don't think this is in Russia's interest at all.
Yeah, so Russia and Iran call each other strategic partners, but there is no actual mutual defense clause between them, meaning Russia has no formal obligation to fight if Iran is attacked. So, what does this gap between rhetoric and commitment reveal about how far Moscow will actually go? And you talked about President Zelensky visiting Middle Eastern states, particularly Syria. So, how do you see that equation?
Well, I just think that this whole term strategic partnership, it seems to mean everything except alliance. In other words, it's whatever form of cooperation it involves. It does not involve a mutual defense commitment. So it's really a big step down from an alliance, but we'll put the best face on it by calling it strategic partnership. What I do think is that Putin, I think, sees himself as benefiting from the U.S. expending time and resources on Iran that obviously aren't going to Ukraine. And so, it benefits Russia to see this conflict. And of course, with the rise in the price of oil as a result of the conflict over Iran, This also benefits the Russians who are, selling their oil at a discount. Now, the discount is from a much higher level, and maybe it even gets to be narrow just because of, that not that much Gulf oil is getting out. So this actually, is very helpful to the Russian war effort.
Yeah. So you talked about the oil prices. So is Moscow's support for Iran less about solidarity and more about managing a war that serves Russia's interest without necessarily wanting Iran to prevail on a political level?
Right. Well, I don't know that in other words, what does prevail here mean? And what they don't want is for the U.S. and Israel to prevail in their stated aims of bringing about the downfall of the Islamic Republic. Nor do they even want something like Venezuela, where the regime is left in place, but its policy changes under U.S. guidance, shall we say. They don't want that either. And so I think that basically Russia benefits from Iranian hostility with the U.S. and Israel, and they don't want that to necessarily end. They don't need Iran to literally win the war, whatever that means. They just need it not to be defeated.
Yeah. Also, Russia frames its relationship with Iran as part of a broader challenge to the Western dominance, is what they call it. But Iran is, absorbing massive military and economic cost while Russian supports stay limited. How long can that ideological framing hold in this context?
Well, it's a good question, and there have been signs in the Iranian press of a degree of resentment. Obviously, the Iranians came to Russia's help in shipping drones and providing, apparently ballistic missiles. That they have even sent advisors, whatever. And the Russians have obviously not reciprocated. In fact, I think what we're seeing is that the Russians are moving their people out of Iran at the moment from certain locations. So this isn't exactly an indication that Russia is going to come to their defense. Now, on the other hand, no matter how unhappy the Iranians might be with the Russians, uh, they can't afford to see that relationship, go down the drain. There's as long as their focus is on the U.S. and Israel, then no matter what the Russians do, that the Iranians are going to stick with them. And I think the Russians are well aware of that.
Yeah, you talked about drones. So Russian-made anti-jamming navigation modules have been found in Iranian drones, also used by Hezbollah. So how should Western governments respond to a Russia that transfers weapons technologies to proxies rather than intervening directly, making accountability even harder to pin down?
Well, it's I think it's the trouble is it's very hard for them to respond directly to Russia. In other words, that these weapons, by their very nature, they're small. There's lots of them. They're widely distributed. It's just very difficult to prevent these kinds of attacks once this material has been gotten out. So, and I think the Russians are are very happy that this is the case. In terms of all they can basically do, it seems to me, is they can put on more sanctions against Russia, which there's already been so many. It just seems that additional ones have diminishing marginal returns, or they can give more support to Ukraine, which I think many European governments are willing to do. The Trump administration does not want to do, at least not at the present. So it's yeah, I think it's very difficult. And of course, for the Trump administration and for certain European governments, they still have this illusion, I believe it is, that somehow they can cut a deal with Putin. That's, in other words, that they don't want to, much as the Trump administration people hate the Iranian government, that they seem to have this notion that somehow working with Russia is possible, and they're not giving up on that illusion, as I believe it is.
So, would Moscow have quite reasons to be quite happy about this if there is a ceasefire on Iranian terms?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire on Iranian terms. The terms that they have proposed, is that the U.S. leaves the Gulf and that Iran has sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and of course, completely ignoring that there's another country, Oman, on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz, that it shares this waterway with. So, I don't see the West as accepting those terms. And I don't see the current Iranian government being willing to accept Western terms either at the moment. In other words, just stop firing on shipping through the Straits of Hormuz, and of course we want them to surrender their uranium stockpiles, to forswear ballistic missiles. And I don't see any Iranian government doing anything like that. So, I just think it's a question of each sees themselves as who's going to outlast the other. And I believe that at the moment, each side seems to think that it can outlast the other somehow or other. That at some point, the other side will have to give in for whatever reason that they have convinced themselves it'll have to give in for. So I think that this could go on for a while. And yeah, there's a I just think that this conflict, in many respects, no matter how punishing it has been for the Iranian government, just feeds into their own sense of they're playing the role of hero in their own drama. Uh, they like this. They're happy to be actively fighting against the Israelis and the Americans, and they think this makes them look legitimate. And it would delegitimize any internal opponent who would say, let's have peace. And as we've seen, the former Iranian foreign minister Zarif, he proposed in the Journal of Foreign Affairs, some kind of peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, and he's been vilified in the Iranian press. People want to string him up, and so I think also with one of the former Iranian presidents as well, that this is the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps moment.
Yeah. So where do you see the exact situation right now on the ground? Do you think US still has a vital edge over Iran, or you think because of the control over Strait of Hormuz, Iran is trying to exercise some sort of,
Right.
muscle
Well,
flexing?
I think it's important. Iran doesn't really control the Strait of Hormuz. What they can simply do is make it too dangerous for others to pass. In other words, in other words, they don't literally prevent anyone from sailing. It's simply a question of, well, if you do, you might get struck uh, by Iranian missiles or drones or whatever. And so it's a question of, are you willing to run that risk or not? And they have let some shipping through. In other words, that they seem to have an alternative system. If you pay them some fee or other and transit through Iranian waters, certain countries' vessels are being allowed to get through. And they're comfortable with this. So it's yeah, they don't really so much control the strait. And so I guess the question is, can the U.S. and Israel raise the cost of doing this for the Iranians? In other words, can they make it so that the costs outweigh whatever benefits that the Iranians have? And I'm not sure that they really can. Now, at a certain point, I think what the Iranians are counting on is that other countries that depend on Gulf oil and gas are just going to insist. And this is going to divide the U.S. from its natural allies. And we've seen the ridicule with which Trump has spoken about the Europeans who have not been willing to join him in this venture, which they had no say in launching. And so it's understandable that they don't want to get involved. That he's indignant that they're not following his lead on this. And I think that I think each side is just counting on that somehow the other side is going to have to change course. And if they just hang on long enough, the other side will do it. Now, from the U.S. and Israeli side, I think that their ability to cause damage to Iran is pretty substantial, and we can continue to do this. But what point do we run low on our own supplies? In other words, that the U.S. in particular seems to be loaded up with highly expensive weaponry, sort of quality over quantity, if you will. And just how much of this does one want to expand on this particular contingency? So I think the Iranians are figuring that they and their drones can outlast this at a certain point that the U.S. will run out of munitions. Now I'm not sure exactly how this is the case and how quickly U.S. production can ramp up, but I do know that it takes a surprisingly long time to produce even a small number of certain kinds of weapons, and I think that's obviously a real bottleneck. That the Ukraine war, with its drones and counter drone measure, has changed the nature of warfare. And I know that the Ukrainians have been holding out their example as something that other Western states should imitate, and other Western states have no, this is a unique form of conflict. The next one's going to be very different. But I think that the Ukrainians may have a point, because I think the Iranians are basically they've learned a lot from the Russian experience in Ukraine. The Russians are teaching them, and the Ukrainians are responding. But I just don't think that the United States and Western countries have really caught on to what is going to be necessary in this new kind of warfare.
Yep. And where does we as West stand in this whole situation? Do you think West has an edge? And what would be your, what would be your assessment on West's position over here?
Well, I just think that it's obviously a challenge, because clearly the Russian challenge in Ukraine and for Europe as a whole is still there. I think a lot of Europeans are really annoyed that Iran, they just don't see as a threat to themselves, and so to be asked to divert resources from confronting what a real enemy to Europe, Russia, to essentially America's and Israel's enemy in the Middle East, maybe some of the Gulf Arab countries as well. But they just don't see this as worthwhile for Europe. And so I think it unfortunately, I think it uh, just increases the possibility that Europe and the U.S. sort of see their interests differently going forward. Maybe this was inevitable. Maybe it was sort of the period in which Europe relied so heavily on American support, even though it's lasted all of my lifetime. That maybe this was a historical anomaly, and we're seeing this come to an end. I hope I would hope not, but it is. And then how will the Europeans respond? In other words, that Europe obviously has the wealth and the resources necessary to build up a robust defense establishment, but doesn't seem to have the will. And part of the reason, of course, is that it's a more elderly population than the United States. In other words, where are you going to get the young people? And in the past, at least up until Trump, the United States did a fairly good job at you know transforming migrants into citizens. Now we're not doing such a good job at that. But Europe has never done such a good job at that. In other words, that if you come from outside of Europe to Europe, you're not European. That's just all there's to it. You can come from other places and become an American, but becoming European is much more difficult to be accepted as such. Would they? Are they? They have a big migrant population in Europe now. Are they willing to let that population into their armed forces? I've got a feeling that the answer is maybe not. But that's too bad, I think, for Europe. I think this would be a path to citizenship, and I think that it would, it would be a good thing. But they're not looking at this, and that's, I think, part of the problem. I think in the West as a whole, and that is, we have defensive goals, and I think rightly so against certain states. But when it comes down to it, these are societies that are not willing any longer to burden themselves unduly with combating them. In other words, that they don't want to um, pay the price in terms of sort of, especially for a young man, in terms of like, okay, you spend 2 years or so in the armed forces. In other words, obviously interrupting your career, your education, whatever. Is this a price that society is willing to pay, much less the individuals involved? And it seems so far that Westerners don't seem to think that they have to pay this price. But I'm afraid that I think that sooner or later that this is something that is going to have to be done, both in Europe and in the United States. That the situation is so serious that these societies are going to have to be better mobilized to deal with the threats that they face.
Yeah, Professor, this has been an incredibly insightful discussion. The relationship between Russia and Iran, as you have explained, is less a true alliance and more a partnership of convenience shaped by overlapping interest. As this conflict continues to evolve, the question will not just be what Russia says, but what it chooses to do and not to do, and how that silence shapes the balance of power across the Middle East and beyond. Thank you once again, sir, for your time. It's been a privilege having you here. Sure.
Well, thank you again for having me on your program. I appreciate it.